Good evening, dear friends, and thank you for joining us. We are continuing with our lectures in our first chamber series, and today we are covering the spheres of the moon and Mercury as we continue with the spheres of Dante. You would remember the last week when we came together. We covered briefly a little bit of the biography of Virgil, a biography of Dante, and we spoke about the meaning and the purpose of these particular works, both Virgil's Aeneid and Dante's Comedy. We also learned that initially this book was called Comedy, not Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy was actually an additional attribute that was given by another great scholar of a century later. So, as we go into this first two spheres in the realm of hell, what ends up happening is that our story begins with Dante finding himself lost in the woods. He does not know how is it that he has become stranded and how is it that he has lost his path. He looks around and he can see the sun shining on the hilltop, and he starts to climb the hill. But as he is doing that, he becomes confronted by a leopard. And as he is confronted by a leopard, the leopard is blocking his way, and he turns away to evade him. But the moment he does that, a hungry lion appears. And this hungry lion then becomes a lot more fearful than the leopard. And as he is contemplating these figures, then a she-wolf comes forward and she drives him back into the darkness of the trees. And as Dante is wandering within the darkness of the trees, there is a figure that approaches him. That figure has a little bit of difficulty speaking, and Dante does not know if it is a man or a spirit, but nevertheless, he approaches him, asking for help. And Virgil says, "I am not a man now, but once I was." As you remember, Virgil is the author of the Aeneid, another book of very deep and profound Gnostic wisdom. So here, in this very beginning, we see that Dante is lost in the woods. And every time that we see the woods, we have to think trees and, of course, the tree of life. So he is lost within the tree, and he is lost there, and he is caught in darkness. That is the same situation in which we find ourselves today. We are in the darkness of our own spirit. And this happens simply because our psychological aggregates are rampant. Many people say, "I pray and I raise my hands unto heaven and I beg God and I pray every day and nothing seems to happen. It's like God does not listen to me, or I just cannot hear him." So let us tell you this. The atom of the Father that exists within the hypothalamus, right there in that space at the root of the nose and the head, it tries to receive those yearnings of the Father. And it tries to communicate directly through the mind. But the problem is that even though our mind has around 300,000 receptors, these are all blocked by our own psychological aggregates. And thus, the Father speaks. We cannot hear it. And as this happens, we submerge ourselves deeper into the darkness of our own ignorance. So he sees this creature, and he does not know if it is a man or if it is a specter, and nevertheless, it asks for help. And Dante realizes that that is Virgil. And the two of them together have come together on Good Friday. Now, this is important because Good Friday is the day that we know of the Passion of the Great Master. It is a day where there is a supreme sacrifice. Here, we see the utmost action of love when it comes on sacrificing for humanity. So on the evening of Good Friday, both poets come together and they start walking and they approach the entrance of hell. The Virgin Mary had sent Beatrice, and Beatrice was Dante's beloved. And Beatrice was in heaven because she had passed away not too long ago. So the Virgin Mary sent Beatrice to instruct Virgil, help Dante rediscover the right path from the dark woods. So they continue walking together and they enter the gate. And at that moment, Dante becomes horrified by the sight of the spirits that were there in the pain. In that particular moment, as they enter the gate and they come in confrontation with those initial sights and the sounds of hell, at once, Dante is moved very deeply and he becomes horrified by the sight of all those spirits in their suffering. All of their cries were making Dante ask, where are these howls coming from? And Virgil replies that these are the souls of the uncommitted. These are those who are neither in heaven, but they are not in hell either, because neither heaven nor hell would have them. Right there are not only those souls of the uncommitted, but they come across also the angels who were not rebellious against God, but angels who were not also faithful to Satan. All those souls that were in that location, hell will not have them. Heaven will not take them. And so, they were meant to remain there with the selfish, forever running behind a banner and eternally being stung by hornets and wasps, with worms at their feet eating the blood and tears of all of these beings. Certainly, Dante was very shocked with all of this. And Virgil continues to lead Dante as his master, as his internal guru. Because even as we go through the many different difficult circumstances of life, there is an internal master that is guiding us. Not only we have the voice of our innermost to give us direction, each one of us has an internal guru that helps us in our path. And Virgil, playing this particular role for Dante, he moves on along the beach of the river Acheron, where the ferryman, a man of name Charon, asked Dante to leave. And he wanted Dante to live because Dante was still alive. And that is certainly not the realm of the living. That is the realm of the dead. So Charon looks at Dante and he tells him, there is a lighter craft out there. Go take it from the other shore so that you can go across. And at that moment, Virgil reprimands Charon and saying, this is willed, and what is willed must happen. And Charon seals his lips. He does not speak. By signs and pushing, he herds the spirits into the boat. And when that happens, a sudden earthquake, accompanied by wind and flashing fire from the ground, terrifies Dante to such a degree that Dante faints. Those winds, those are the winds of our own mind. Those are the winds of the chaos that exists within our own thoughts. Many students have the problem of trying to meditate, and they complain because they cannot quiet their mind. So those minds that are in that level of chaos, those minds that are in that level of constant projections, they are all experiencing those winds and the flashing fire Well, the flashing fire has to do with the many difficult circumstances that we experience in life. Because those flashing fires are shocking, and we are constantly getting shocks in our consciousness. It is just that we forget that we need to transform all of those impressions so that our consciousness can then take the teaching from the experience in the moment and discard everything else that is just noise and symptoms, you see? But the important thing is that here, Dante faints. And he faints. And that fainting is a symbol of death. That is the very same small death that we all experience every night when we go to sleep. But here, that fainting means that he became void of all of his senses. And friends, the moment that we become void of senses, we have met exactly the right definition of what death actually means. So they happen to cross the river, and as they get to the other side, Dante wakes up to the clap of thunder. You see, as they were crossing, Dante found himself asleep for some time, and his eyes were very resting. So he found himself all of a sudden across the river Acheron and on the brink of a deep abyss from which he was hearing the thunder of hell's eternal cry. Virgil asked Dante to follow him, but Dante was very worried because Virgil all of a sudden was very pale. And Virgil told him that his countenance was looking like that, not because of fear, but because the suffering that he was experiencing and the pity that he was feeling for all of those souls. So at those moments, it is here where the two poets enter the first region of hell, which is known as the sphere of the moon. This sphere of the moon is Limbus. If you get to us from learning stuff in the Christian tradition, you must have learned that Limbus was some place where you were neither in heaven nor in hell. So this is exactly that. And here, as Dante and Virgil are entering this particular circle, Virgil is explaining Dante that the souls that they are seeing, all of those shades that are hiding under the rocks, they are there because they were born without the benefit of Christianity. Either because they were born before the times of Christ, or because their soul was the soul of an unbaptized child. Dante and Virgil see that there are some prominent figures here. And they see that there is Homer, and there is Horace, and there is Ovid, and there is Lucan. And they are all saluting Dante and greeting him. So Dante and Virgil then cross a stream, and they go through the 7 gates, and they reach a meadow. Socrates, Plato, Cicero, Seneca, Aristotle, we're all there. And they leave the quiet place, and they come to one where all of a sudden there is no light. Friends, the fact that they come to this particular sphere, and Virgil is telling Dante that those souls are there for 2 reasons. Either because they were born without the benefit of Christianity, or because those were the souls of unbaptized children. There is a deep and profound teaching there for all of us. Because what it means that they were born before Christianity, it does not mean that they did not raise their hands at some point and accepted Jesus as their only personal savior, and thus everything was resolved for them. That is not what that means. That means that they did not receive the mysteries of the Christ. They did not receive the mysteries of that thing that we know as the revolution of the consciousness, which has to do with achieving a mystical death. That death that comes from understanding our defects and eliminating them with the help of our Divine Mother. They did not know about the development of the superior attributes and faculties of the being, all of which attributes, faculties, powers, virtues, laws, and bodies, they altogether make up what is indeed the soul. And of course, because they did not have this, they were not offering a true sacrifice for humanity, helping others achieve what we are all striving for, which is to achieve happiness, to be able to get out of this realm of suffering. But it also says that they were not baptized. And what that means is not that they were not submerged in some river, that somebody did not grab some water from a pyre and just moisten their hair. That is not that. That means that if they were not baptized, they did not exercise a pact of waters. And that pact of waters is intimately associated with our creative powers. It is certainly the mystery that exists behind the super dynamic of love. They did not know about the great mystery, and they did not know about the great arcanum. So those who do not practice the great arcanum, those who do not get into this pact of waters, well, they certainly have to work in their revolution of the consciousness. They have to work in sacrifice for others and eliminating their defects, and of course seeking to incarnate the attributes and the faculties of the being. But if none of that is done, then it is here where all of these souls come to rest. Once that 108th death is achieved at the end of their cycle of the transmigration of the souls. Samael tells us that this very first submerged region, it corresponds to limbus. And limbus, what it means is a small branch of a tree. It also means edge or border. So let us tell you this, friends, because it's important that we know why is it that limbus means edge? Why is it that it means border? Because all of us have penetrated in this particular region of hell. And that has happened every time that we have had a nightmare. But let us tell you this. Let's not confuse nightmare with a bad dream. Because in a bad dream, you may feel afraid and you may be scared. You may see yourself crying. And there are plenty of learnings to get out of that. But when we are speaking about a nightmare, every time that you have had a nightmare and you have seen yourself trying to run and your feet are so heavy that you cannot move them, you are in limbus. Every time that you're having a nightmare and you try to fight, but your arms are so heavy that you cannot defend yourself, you are in limbus. Every time that you try to scream, and as you try to scream, nothing comes out, friend, you are in limbus. And the reason that is happening is because in this particular first sphere of hell, we see that this sphere of the moon is governed by 96 laws. The physical plane is governed by 48. And 96 laws add enough mechanicity and they add enough brutality into the experience of existence that you have experienced how difficult it is to move, how difficult it is to displace yourself, and how terrifying that is. Because whenever we find ourselves in that first region of hell, the moment that we see those terrifying images and we try to fight and we try to run and we try to scream for help and nothing happens, we immediately return our astral body into the physical body. And you know how the physical body reacts to that. This particular first region is limbus. And remember, limbus means a branch of a tree. It means edge and it means proximity. So here we see all those who died without receiving the baptismal waters. So now we know that that pact of waters, which is baptism, it has to do with the transmutation of our sexual creative waters. It has to do with the usage of our creative energy so that as we transmute it, that we can create the superior existential bodies of the being, and that we can use of that electricity from that act of the super dynamic of love to work in the elimination of our aggregates. And of course, this has to be in the sphere of the moon, because we have already learned in our pre-chamber that the moon governs all things that have to do with liquids. It regulates the tides. It affects the ways that hormones operate and are released in our body. It also regulates the accumulation of liquids in plants and in vegetation as well. So all of this happens because of the moon. And thus, it is here where we see all of these particular souls. Limbus is made up of the network of caves and caverns that exist throughout Earth. So as we are descending into the lower spheres of creation, as we see all these caverns, as we go and we visit them, and we become mesmerized with the prismatic colors, and we love the different variations of shades, and we admire the stalactites and the stalagmites and everything else, let's keep in mind that within that mineral region, there are plenty of souls that are starting their journey into a period of very significant purification. And because we work with our minds, and with our minds, we alter the ideoplastic, what we see within the sphere of the moon is the same stuff that we see here in the physical plane. Just like you walk outside of your house and you see buildings and streets, you see roads and vehicles, and you see people walking to and fro, the same thing happens there. Samael shares with us a very peculiar story, that as he was walking voluntarily in this sphere of the moon, he came across a man who was working, and on his back he was carrying a bag made of sackcloth, just loaded with stuff. And the man was walking and carrying it and suffering with it. And Samael told the man, "Hey, dear friend, have you noticed that you're no longer alive? Have you not realized that you are dead?" The man would not believe him. And Samael would invite him to jump, and he would jump. And when he jumped, he would remain suspended in air for just a small fraction of our time. But he would precipitate himself head first into the ground. Of course, because we precipitate ourselves head first into the abyss, exactly as we see it in Arcanum 16. In that fulminated tower, that as the lightning destroys the tower, we see that there are both a man and a woman falling like inverted pentagrams into the lower realms of creation. The sphere of the moon is governed by 96 laws, and here is where we start seeing the brutality of the catabolic forces of nature. So as we told you, Dante and Virgil passed over the stream. They went through the 7 gates, and they reached a green meadow. And as they were there, Dante was able to recognize the figures of authority who were dwelling there. And as the poet stood on a small hill, Dante gave names of rulers, philosophers, and others who were there, and he regretted that he did not have the time to name them all. So Dante and Virgil left that particular place, and they walked into a particular region where there was no light. And it is there where they left that vestibule of hell, which is Limbus. And they walked into that space where there is indeed the beginning of hell itself. The sphere of Mercury is a smaller circle. As Dante and Virgil continued descending into this second circle, they noticed that the sphere of Mercury was slightly smaller than the sphere of the moon. And it is because it is there where hell begins. And here is where, as Dante states, the sinners start being punished by all of their sins. And as they walk in, they see a very colossal figure staring at them. They witnessed Minos. Minos is a great beast. And Minos has a body that has a tail of a serpent. And his job is to examine each one of the souls as it stands for judgment. And based on the judgment that is delivered to each one of those souls, Minos would wrap his tail. And based on the number of times that that tail wraps upon himself, that is the very same number of the sphere where that soul needs to go. Minos will hear all of those souls confess all of their sins. And as he wraps his tail around himself, he then lets them know what is the circle where they belong. And as he notices that Dante is looking at him, he tells Dante to beware of where he goes and to whom he turns. He cautions Dante against entering, but Virgil silences him, first by asking him too many questions, but then by telling him the same words that Virgil told Charon. And he said, "It has been willed, and what is willed must be done." As they contemplate the first images of hell, they notice that these places are in just complete darkness. The noise that they experience here is worse than that of a storm at sea. They hear the lamentations, the moaning, and the shrieking. The spirits are whirled and they are swept by an encasing storm. And Dante learns that there are the spirits that are doomed by carnal lust. When he asks to particularly speak to two of the sinners who are together, Virgil tells him to call them to him in the name of love. All of these souls that find themselves in the sphere of Mercury, they are experiencing the violence of their own infrasexuality. It is here where all of these souls are experiencing the complete opposite of what they would have been experiencing on Earth, provided that they had embraced the practice of the super dynamic of love. Here, all of those connections are violent. They are torturous. And those winds are whirling and sweeping them because those winds are reflective of a chaotic mind. So don't forget that. Every time that we see tempestuous winds, that is always a symbol of a mind that is in chaos. So again, Dante saw those two sinners together, and Virgil told them, call them in the name of love. And so he did. And as they came, one of them thanks Dante for his pity and wishes him peace. And she shares with him her story. She reveals to him that a lover, she reveals to him that a lower circle of hell waits for the man who murdered them. And with his head bowed, Dante told Virgil that he was thinking of the sweet thoughts and desires that brought all those lovers into that place. So he calls Francesca by her name, and he asked her to explain how she and her lover were lured into sin. The name Francesca is not by coincidence, and it's certainly not by mistake. Francesca comes from the German root word Frankon, which means javelin. It means lance. And we have seen, as we have been educating ourselves and developing this intellectual culture of the intermediate level studies, that arrows, lances, spears, and swords, they are all symbols of our sexual libido. They are symbols of our own sexual creative power, of all of that creative strength. So it is then no surprise. Why is it that the first image that he sees is that of a soul called Francesca? Francesca replies to him, and she replies that a book of the romance of Lancelot and Guinevere was the main reason for their downfall. She says, we were alone, we were reading it out loud, and so many parts of the book seemed to tell of our own love. So we kissed, and as we kissed, the book was forgotten, and we read no more that day. And of course, what happens there is the very same example of what we see in the book of Genesis. When Adam and Eve grab that fruit from the forbidden tree and they eat of it. And just like she says that they read no more, they did not read any more that day, that the book was forgotten, just in that very same state of dissociation, Adam and Eve lost of their senses. And then losing of the senses means death. So Francesca shares her story. And as she has shared her story, the other spirits that were around, they were weeping bitterly. And Dante was so moved by pity that he also wept. And then again, he once again fainted. Friends, here in this particular sphere of Mercury, where we see that all of those suffering by their carnal lust end up. Here we see the dark aspect of Helen of Troy, daughter of Zeus, daughter of Zeus, sister of Castor and Pollux. Here, in this very same sphere of Mercury, we see Paris, the son of Priam, king of Troy, abducting Helen, was the killer of Achilles. Achilles, if you will remember, he was a demigod. He was the son of the nymph Tethys, and his father was Peleus. And he was submerged in the river Styx by his mother. But as she submerged him, she had to hold him by one of his feet. And she held on to him with 2 fingers around his ankle. And that is how she dipped him in the Styx. And he became all powerful and invincible, except in that area where the water did not touch him, where the fingers of his mother were holding on to him. This is so profound, because here we see that a man becomes a demigod, aided by the help of his mother. He becomes a god because he is submerged in the waters. And friends, those waters are our very own creative waters. Every time that the day comes around and we go through challenging circumstances, where we argue with someone or somebody calls us names, where we feel that we are sad because of so many reasons in our mind, we are wasting of our creative power miserably. And not only we are wasting it, we are wasting it in a way that is equivalent of having a nuclear power plant just wasting all of its energy. If we waste of our creative powers during the day, then there is nothing left for our spiritual practice at night. If we spend the day complaining and lamenting about how bad our day has been, when night comes, becomes very difficult for us to do an exercise of retrospection, and even becomes more difficult for us to be able to see how is it that our thoughts and our emotions and our habits were affected during the day. With these difficulties, we cannot comprehend our defects. So we need of this creative power. We need of our creative waters to safeguard them so that our superior powers can then become manifest. But here we see that Achilles, that he died. And he died because he suffered a wound that was inflicted by an arrow. And it so happens that the arrow struck him exactly in his ankle. This is how Achilles died. And now that we know that the arrows and the lances and the javelins, that they are all a symbol of our sexual libido, then now we can understand that Achilles died, meaning that he lost all of his senses, because there was suffering and damage inflicted by not being able to control his creative power. Friends, as Dante and Virgil descend into the spheres of hell, they go in through the vestibule of the indecisive. That is the sphere of the moon. And as they cross the river Acheron and they go through limbo, they get into the city and they go through 7 particular gates. And after they do that, they have access into the circle of the lustful, which is the sphere of Mercury. In Limbus, we see the unbaptized and we see the virtuous pagans. We see all those who never defined themselves. We see all those who did not receive or manifest in their lives a pact of waters. And in the second circle, which is the circle of Mercury, we see all those who are suffering there because of their own carnal passions. So you have heard us speak about the moon, and you have heard us speak about Mercury. So what we would like you to keep in mind is that each one of these particular spheres correspond to each one of the planets in our solar system. And when we speak of planets, we're not just speaking about what we know from our science at school, where they tell us that we have a sun and that the moon is a satellite of the earth and that we have the other things are planets. Here we're speaking a little bit different. So we invite you to open yourself to that which is known. Because when we speak of planets, we are speaking of those bodies that wander in space. This is the actual definition of planet, a space wanderer. So from that perspective, as the sun drags the solar system throughout the space of the galaxy, the sun is also a planet. And because the moon trails the earth, the moon is also wandering in space, and thus it is also a planet. So we start with the moon. We go then into the sphere of Mercury. And as we continue descending into the spheres of hell, we will go into the sphere of Venus, and then into the sphere of the Sun and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. And when we get into the 9th sphere of hell, we will see the aspects of Uranus and the aspects of Neptune. And in Christianity, we know that there are hierarchies of angels associated to each one of these planets. What we know as angels, they are associated with the heavens of the moon. What we know as archangels, they are associated with the heavens of Mercury. Principalities with the heavens of Venus. Virtues with the sun. Powers with the heavens of Mars. Dominions with the heavens of Jupiter. And then we have thrones and the cherubim and the seraphim. And those correspond to the heavens of Saturn and Uranus and Neptune respectively. So in Christianity, we know of these hierarchies of angels. And these hierarchies of angels, as they exist in the heavens of these planets, those heavens have specific names as celestial regions. When we disconnect ourselves from the spheres of hell and we contemplate the heavens, As we look at that heaven of the moon, that is the astral plane. And the astral plane in the fifth dimension has a superior region, which is where we have the angels, and it has an inferior region. The inferior region of the astral plane, which is the circle of the moon, is limbus. So when you are in your astral body and all of a sudden you find yourself in contact with people who you love, who have passed some time ago, it is because you are together with them in that vestibule of the moon. You have not penetrated limbus per se. You're not yet in that sphere of the moon, but you are in that vestibule. The celestial region that corresponds to the archangels is the mental plane. And the principalities, where we have Tiferet, beauty, the human soul, that is the causal plane. Virtues exist in the celestial region that is known as the realm of the spiritual soul, of our buddhi. That is the sphere of Geburah. Powers exist in the realm of Atman, our innermost. And here, when we speak of the Buddhic realm and the realm of Atman, we are speaking about the sixth dimension. Dominions exist in Nirvana. And Nirvana is a realm of happiness. But beyond Nirvana is Paranirvana, where we have the thrones. And beyond that, we have Maha Paranirvana, which is the realm of the cherubim. And beyond that, in the realm of the seraphim, that is known as the Empyreum. And we can get there. And we have been given not only the solar seeds to be able to get there, but we have also been given the doctrine and the teachings and the practices so that we can make a change. In most cases, most of you listening to these lectures have already received the Great Arcanum. But we have to put to use the instruments that we are given today. That means that we have to make use of our daily retrospection so that we can see how our defects affect our intellect. How is it that our thinking becomes so illogical? We have to be able to steal the fire away from the ego by refraining our reaction so that later we can see how is it that we were going to be reacting emotionally. How is it that our instinctive center at the base of the spine is moving us to respond in ways that speak of survival, of trying to defend our egos as if it were the last thing that we had to do? But also, how is it that our motor center that exists at the very top of our spine, how is it that it affects our habits? Why is it that we clench our teeth, that we just close our fists until our knuckles turn white when we are in anger? Why is it that when we sit, that our legs don't stop shaking? We have to comprehend this, because all of this is an indication that all of that energy is being sourced out of one specific location, and that is our sexual creative center. For us, this is difficult. We know that living life and the problems of life are a challenge. And we acknowledge that most of the things that we share here, you may be able to receive them and say, that is easier said than done. We understand that. But we have to deal with the consequences of our own actions. And also, we have to deal with the atoms of the secret enemy that exist at the very bottom tip of our own spine. Because those atoms of the secret enemy, they remain there, and they have created a very profound effect in the 5 cylinders of the human machine. Because when we were given the Kunda buffer organ back at the time of the 3rd subrace of the Lemurian race, that organ remained there longer than what it should have been. And we became fascinated with the sensations of the physicality. And today, we carry those consequences. So today, we have to bring in more effort. We have to bring in our willpower so that we can make a change. Because when it comes to our condition on the children of Adam and Eve we are more like Cain. Let's look at the story of what happened with Cain and Abel. Because in the story of the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are of course symbols of that third subrace, of the third great race that was the Lemurian race. But Adam and Eve are also symbols of our mind and our sexuality. Adam is a symbol of the brain, and Eve is a symbol of our creative organs. This is why when Eve consumed the forbidden fruit from the tree of life, that is why she gave of that fruit to Adam. She suffered the consequence first, and then she affected the mind. And you know this to be very true. Every time that you consume of that forbidden fruit that comes from fornication, the first effect happens at the level of the creative organs, and immediately afterwards the mind follows suit, and it also becomes affected. But Adam and Eve had children, and they had Cain and they had Abel. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Abel is our inferior aspect. For all purposes, Abel is just the combination, the aggregation of all of our inferior negative values. And Abel is the combination of all of our positive values. All of those egos that we have that are trying to be altruistic, that are trying to help others, that are trying to bring happiness, that eventually they also have to be eliminated. But here we see that even though Abel can be a symbol of our positive values, Abel can also be a symbol of the consciousness that we have incarnated from our innermost. And that consciousness would offer sacrifices that our innermost, the Lord, El, will look with favor. But our inhumanities, which are symbolized by Cain, these inhumanities like our lusts and our angers, our resentments towards the people at school and our friends at work, there is no room in heaven for any of that inferior aspects. Of course, they cannot be looked with favor. So if we do what is right, then our sacrifice would be adequately accepted. But if we do not do what is right, then we will remain outside at the door. And outside is in those realms of hell. Friends, our internal Cain has three particular aspects. Our internal Cain is the demon of desire, symbolized by Judas. And the second aspect of our internal Cain is Pilates, the demon of the mind. That demon that we carry within that always washes his hands. You see, it is never his fault. It is always someone else's responsibility. This is what we do. Because we don't blame ourselves for our misery. We look around and we say, that person said something and now I'm hurt, so it's their fault. We don't see our defects reflected in others. We forget when we also say things about other people. We also forget that we need to be compassionate. And to be compassionate with others, we have to comprehend ourselves first. And Cain is also made of Cephas, who is the demon of ill will. On the outside, he looks friendly, he looks wise, he looks nice, he looks trustworthy. But on the inside, There is resentment. There is vengeance, ambition and greed. There is lust and pride. There is arrogance, self-consideration, etc., etc. So we have to work with the elimination of our own demon of desire, of our own demon of the mind, and our own demon of ill will, so that we can eliminate our internal Cain. Notice that Cain killed Abel by smashing him with a rock. That is the incorrect use of the stone. And we know that we are here to chisel our stone. We have to chisel our philosopher's stone. And that philosopher's stone is indeed our ethereal body. And we chisel it by transmuting of our creative waters through the super dynamic of love in the flaming forge of Vulcan. So rather than working on perfecting his stone, Cain, with all its desires and all of its irresponsibilities and all of its ill will, it took of that creative force and it destroyed Abel, which is the same thing that we do with our own consciousness every time that we forget about it and we go with the interests of the ego and the personality. So we have to make a change. We have to be able to walk back into the Garden of Eden out through the narrow door that we left Eden. And that narrow door is that superior aspect of sexuality. It is that union where we transform our creative power together so that we can create the superior bodies of the being, so that we can go through a radical internal transformation. And thus, the words of the Apostle Matthew when he tells us, small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. But friends, if you're here listening to this lecture, that means that your center of consciousness is active. And that means that you are here and you have received the map and the directions on that narrow road that lead to life. It is up to you to bring up the necessary willpower so that you can grab that map and walk life with all of its problems and achieve an internal transformation so that you can find that narrow door. Friends, this has been the end of our lecture. We are certainly grateful to all of these sources, out of which we were able to gather these images and put this presentation together. And of course, we sourced all of our material from Samael's lecture, The Spheres of the Moon and Mercury. Dear friends, this has been part 1 on the spheres of Dante, the spheres of the Moon and Mercury. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and may all beings be happy.